Dennis here, welcoming you to a second in my new YouTube series, Adventures in Treasure Hunting. I've been hunting artifacts, relics, and just plain trash for nigh into 30 years now. Just does not seem possible. In my case, the old adage is true, time flies when you're having fun. In this episode, I want to tell you about some of my adventures in hunting for Indian artifacts. See, in the beginning, my first wife, Kathy, seemed to share in the enthusiasm of the hunt. I have some very fond memories of hunting artifacts with her. The first incident took place around 1987. I recall that one evening, Kathy and I decided to take a stroll down the railroad tracks which lay just behind my parents' home. We were headed south toward our old Vanetton Creek site, but we were not planning on going there that evening. We were walking beside a cutout area which left a sort of bank beside the tracks. At the time, there were pine and cedar trees growing on top of the bank. What caught my eyes was where some little critter had been digging into the roots of a tree and depositing them all around his burrow hole. I think the idea struck both Kathy and I at the same time. We went over to the burrow and began looking through the sand, and right off began finding Indian pottery shards. And not just a few, we found a lot. We actually spent about 45 minutes going through the sand, and we had a large pile of shards with many both rim and body pieces. Later, when we went home and counted them, there were over 300 of them. However, there was a bit of a dilemma, how to get them home. There were many other collectors in the area at that time, and I didn't want to leave them because somebody might really very easily come along and gather them up and take off with our find. There were many things that I enjoyed and appreciated about my first wife. One of those is that she was very resourceful. With no other way to carry them home, she stripped off her socks and put the shards in them. And they held them all, but it looked as if the socks were about ready to burst. It didn't bother Kathy that she had to walk home barefoot. She was a country girl at heart, and walking barefoot was something she enjoyed. As I recall, based on the rim shards, at least 2 different pottery vessels were represented by the pieces that we found. The style also dated them to the late woodland era, which meant that they were between 400 and 1400 years old. Now, at the time, I was doing quite a bit of freelance writing and had been published in quite a few magazines. I wrote the story of this find and submitted it to Michigan Out of Doors magazine. Parts of the article were written very tongue-in-cheek and were meant to be humorous. So, I had likened my wife's feet to those of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot in the article. I mean, after all, the socks were able to carry all of that pottery. But the comment was well-intended. That's not how it was taken, though. What I thought was funny, she didn't, and she was rather upset about it for a time. But all that smoothed over, and at least for a season, the pottery find was housed in the collections of our private museum. Around that same time, I found myself alone doing some digging again at the old Vanetton Creek site. To my surprise, my mother-in-law, Gladys, came walking down the trail to see how I was doing. She is one of the nicest people that you could ever want to meet, and the true love of Jesus shone through her. I was really excited as just moments before she arrived, I had made a most spectacular find. I took from the ground a perfectly formed 7-inch stone knife made of Bayport chert. Bayport chert came from the thumb area of Michigan. The base was squared and thin, and it would have secured easily and tightly into a wood or bone handle. But that was not all that there was of this particular find. At the same depth and only inches away from it were several other artifacts which were quite unique to find, and in a sense almost told a story all of their own. There was a chunk of red ochre, a mineral that the Indians used a lot, especially in preparing the linings of their graves, because the red ochre to them simulated the color of life. So anyways, there was a chunk of red ochre, a chunk of silver graphite, a small finger pestle, and a small mortar. Now, I discussed this find with several friends that were well educated in artifacts. They both offered the same conclusion. It would seem, for all intents and purposes, this was a Braves makeup kit. These minerals were likely ground using the mortar and pestle, mixed with perhaps bear grease, and then applied to the face and body. The red ochre and graphite would have made a striking contrast to each other when painted on. There are 3 distinct levels at this particular site, and nearly all the artifacts found on the highest level date to the late woodland, which again would be about 400 or 500 years to 1400 years ago. And at the same site, I made another, what I consider rather spectacular find, especially when you consider the circumstances of making that find. This took place in the fall, and it was quite chilly outside. It was early morning. I had taken off the day from work because I had a mild case of the flu. And despite body aches and vomiting, I decided to get some fresh air. So I headed for the old Benetton Creek site, which was really maybe a half a mile from my parents' home. The level I was on was a ridge, and at this particular spot, that ridge dropped off about 20 feet. I had my shovel over my shoulder, and I was prepared to dig in this area that I had never dug in before. As I was walking along, I began to get dizzy, and my mouth began salivating like right before you throw up, This awful feeling, I hate it. I was trying to hold back from doing that, and things began to sort of slowly spin around me. I lost my balance and tumbled over the ridge. The shovel went flying, and I more or less rolled down the 20 feet to the bottom of the bluff. I laid there for a long time, and with no more fight left in me, I began throwing up repeatedly. I was feeling rather weak, to say the least, but I got up, spotted my shovel near the base of a dead tree. It had actually stuck into the ground, and I managed to get the shovel and pulled it out of the ground. In doing so, I heard a scraping sound. The shovel had rubbed against stone, so as sick as I was, I dug out a couple shovels full of dirt, and when to my surprise laying there was a celt in the most perfect condition, finest one I'd ever seen, even in museums. It was dark, almost black stone, and measured 8 to 9 inches long. The pole end was rounded, but was also squared, and the bit was perfect without a chip or a ding in it. It looked as though it had never been used. I was still sicker than a dog, as the old adage goes, but what a most extraordinary find, and I'll never forget that day, nor the events surrounding it. Kathy and I had purchased a quad runner, and man, I loved that machine. I even named it. I called it Schoolcraft, after Michigan's first Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And I named it that because I figured we'd use it in a lot of our artifact hunting expeditions. And we did use it in a few. But at any rate, one evening during the summer, I decided to take Schoolcraft for a ride down a trail by the railroad tracks that headed north. I maybe got a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from my parents' house, and Schoolcraft stopped, and I could not get it running again. The trail was all old beach sand from a time when Benetton Lake was much higher than it is today. Now, up to this point, I had found nothing dating back past the Middle Woodland period, which dated from 100 BC to 500 AD, and that was mostly pottery shards. But as I got off Schoolcraft, I was about to make a find which dated to the late Archaic, which would make it from between 2500 BC and 1200 BC. I was standing in front of the quad runner when I looked down, and right where we had stopped, and I found a truly beautiful black notched arrowhead. It was double notched, I should say. And as far as I have ever found out, this style was only used during the late Archaic period in Michigan. The arrowhead measured about 1.5 inches long, was very thin and perfectly crafted, no flaws. And the material it was made from did not hail from Michigan. And this could mean a few different things. One, that it was made from Upper Blue Mercer, which is from Ohio. So either someone from Michigan went down to Ohio and got a stock, or the material was brought here via a trading route. Two, the material may also have been obsidian, which originates out in the Northwest, up by Washington State. And the scenario would be, exactly the same. I would have loved to have studied this piece more, but it was taken when I was doing a school display with my son Dennis for what I believe was the 4th grade. Well, there were many more fascinating finds of Native American artifacts, but I will save those for another episode. One last find to tell you about this time, because it illustrates that you find things in the most unexpected places. You never know when you will find an artifact, so always keep your eyes open and looking toward the ground. Even in the city, a few blocks from my house is a meat market, and as I was going through their parking lot, I noticed they had piled stones up toward the back from when they were preparing the lot for paving. I walked over, and with just a casual look, I found an excellent sandwich stone, also known as nutting stones, and they were used for grinding and breaking open nuts and acorns. What surprised me about the find is, again, where it was, in the city. Enough for now. I want to take a moment to wish you all a very happy, joyous, and prosperous New Year, and I hope you'll be looking forward to episode 3 of my adventures in treasure hunting.